In the summer of 1940, the United States watched Europe with a mixture of fascination, anxiety, and disbelief. Across the Atlantic, nations were falling one by one. France, a country that had seemed invincible to many Americans, crumbled under the swift and devastating assault of the German Wehrmacht. Belgian cities burned. Dutch towns were occupied. The Blitzkrieg had proven frighteningly efficient, and Britain now stood alone as the last significant bastion against Hitler's ambitions in Western Europe. For Americans, the events seemed almost unreal, as if they were scenes from a foreign painting or a newsreel flickering on the cinema screen. Isolationist sentiment in the United States was strong. The country was still recovering from the Great Depression. Memories of World War I, which had cost so many lives for unclear reasons, were fresh in the minds of the older generation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration understood the looming threat, but were constrained by law, public opinion, and political caution. Congress had passed neutrality acts in the 1930s to ensure the nation would not be drawn into another overseas conflict. Yet, behind closed doors, Roosevelt and his advisors watched the skies over Britain with growing concern. The fall of France, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, and the constant Luftwaffe raids signaled that if Britain fell, Hitler's power would stretch across the continent unchecked. On the streets of New York, Chicago, and Boston, Americans read about the bombing of London, the desperate scramble of RAF pilots, and the courage of a nation refusing to surrender. Newspapers carried the first portraits of the young men who would soon be called the Few, the Spitfire and Hurricane pilots who defended the island nation with skill, determination, and sheer audacity. For many Americans, it was difficult to imagine such heroism taking place thousands of miles away. Yet the stories resonated. There was something deeply human in the struggle, a David versus Goliath battle in the skies, a fight for survival and freedom against a seemingly unstoppable enemy. Among the public, a quiet curiosity grew. Some were inspired, some fearful, and some dismissive, believing Britain might still fall, and that the Atlantic Ocean would protect the United States. But a small and determined group of Americans saw things differently. They could not remain on the sidelines. Young men, some fresh from college, others with a few years of work or military training, read about the RAF's desperate need for pilots and made decisions that would alter the course of their lives forever. They sought out British recruitment offices, training programs, and flight schools. Many traveled first to Canada, where the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan provided a legal and logistical pathway to join the RAF. Others crossed the Atlantic directly, often risking diplomatic complications because their commitment to defending Britain outweighed the comfort of staying home. These young Americans were motivated by more than mere adventure. They were driven by a sense of justice, a belief in liberty, and a moral conviction that the spread of tyranny could not be allowed to continue unchecked. They understood that even if their nation remained neutral for now, freedom in Europe was entwined with the survival of democratic ideals worldwide. Upon arrival in Britain or Canada, the volunteers were met with rigorous training and a world unlike any they had known. They were immersed in British culture, customs, and procedures. They learned the idiosyncrasies of Spitfires and Hurricanes, the quirks of British airfields, and the importance of teamwork under the pressures of war. Many struggled at first, their American habits and instincts clashing with the strict discipline and precise methods of the RAF. But the seriousness of the moment left little room for hesitation. There were long nights poring over maps, intense flight drills in unpredictable weather, and lectures on enemy tactics that could save their lives or end them. In these training bases, friendships formed quickly, often under the shadow of mortality. British instructors, many of whom had already faced combat over France, were strict but supportive, knowing that every successful student might one day be the difference between victory and defeat in the skies over southern England. Letters home became vital for morale. Young Americans wrote to families, describing the strange new world of the RAF, the thunder of aircraft engines, the smell of aviation fuel, and the thrill of their first solo flights. Some wrote about fear of failure, fear of combat, but also about a growing sense of purpose. They were not merely learning to fly, they were preparing to stand against an enemy that threatened civilization itself. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the American public began to take notice of their fellow citizens' commitment. Newspapers occasionally ran stories highlighting these volunteers, and word spread of their courage. To many, these were not just Americans abroad. They were symbols of moral clarity, living proof that even in a neutral country, individuals could choose to fight for what was right. In a nation still debating intervention, these men represented the bridge between distant Europe and the United States. Their actions foreshadowed the eventual alliance that would become critical once America formally entered the war in December 1941. Even before Lend-Lease shipments began, and before U.S. pilots officially took to combat in Europe, these volunteers demonstrated the interconnectedness of the Atlantic nations. They were the first tangible sign that the United States, though not yet at war, had already begun to influence the fight for Britain's survival. Their stories of boarding planes over English countryside, climbing through clouds to intercept enemy bombers, and surviving impossible odds would ripple across time, inspiring generations of pilots, historians, and citizens alike. In those early months, America watched from afar. Yet through the courage of its sons and the resolve of Britain, the stage was set for a transatlantic partnership that would help determine the fate of the free world. By the time the first Spitfires climbed into the sky on a dawn scramble, the line between neutrality and involvement blurred. Though the U.S. had not yet officially joined the fight, the hearts and hands of Americans were already in the air, soaring over fields, towns, and rivers far from home, united with Britain in a battle for survival, freedom, and the very soul of Europe. And thus began the story of the Americans in the Battle of Britain, volunteers, adventurers, patriots, and heroes, whose courage, far from their homeland, would leave a lasting imprint on history and forge a connection between nations that could not be broken. The journey from America to Britain in 1940 was neither simple nor safe. Young men from New York, Chicago, Boston, and even small towns across the Midwest left behind everything familiar: family, friends, and futures they might never return to, driven by a singular purpose: to fight for freedom in a distant land under siege. Many first traveled to Canada, where the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan provided the only legal and practical avenue for foreign volunteers to join the RAF. They crossed frozen lakes, navigated snowy airfields, and endured months of rigorous instruction, learning the basics of flight and the specifics of the British aircraft they would soon operate. Others, more audacious, made their way directly to England, often risking arrest or diplomatic complications. Once in Britain, the young Americans were immersed in a new and foreign world. The cadence of British English, the customs of RAF life, the taste of tea instead of coffee, and the constant backdrop of war-blitzed cities, air raid sirens, and anti-aircraft batteries were all part of a reality far removed from home. Yet the challenges went deeper than culture. The RAF expected excellence, precision, and unwavering discipline. Every morning began with drills, maintenance checks, and lessons in aerial tactics. Simulated dogfights tested reflexes and instincts. Pilots were taught to read the sky, to anticipate the enemy, and to react without hesitation. The Americans were often underestimated by British instructors, dismissed at first as untested outsiders with little understanding of the European theater. But they quickly proved their mettle. Their natural skill, adaptability, and determination impressed even the most hardened veterans. Soon, American pilots were flying in mixed squadrons alongside Britons, Canadians, and other Commonwealth airmen, forming bonds that transcended nationality and forged under the pressure of imminent death. Among the first volunteers were men like Billy Fisk, a former Olympic bobsledder, whose daring and skill in the cockpit made him a legend before he was even 22. Fisk's story, along with others like it, became emblematic of the bravery, recklessness, and commitment that characterized the Americans who joined the RAF. For these young men, the danger was real from the first day in the air. Even during training flights, aircraft stalled, engines failed, and mistakes could be fatal. But they learned quickly, propelled by adrenaline, fear, and a sense of purpose. Instructors drilled into them the reality that once in combat, there would be no room for hesitation. The enemy did not forgive mistakes. When they were finally assigned to operational squadrons, often in the southeast of England, the Americans confronted the full scope of the Battle of Britain. Their first sorties were terrifying. The sky was filled with contrails, black puffs of smoke, and the distant roar of German engines. Spitfires and Hurricanes climbed through clouds to meet the enemy, their pilots scanning constantly for the sudden shadow of a Messerschmitt, the telltale glint of an enemy aircraft in the sun, or the sharp whistle of incoming bullets. Radio chatter crackled with tension, warnings of approaching formations, reports of damaged aircraft, frantic calls for assistance. Young American pilots, many still barely trained, found themselves in life or death situations where seconds determined survival. Some were hit on their first missions, forced to bail out over fields or the Channel, discovering immediately the terrifying solitude of parachuting into a hostile landscape. Others returned exhilarated, their nerves raw, but their confidence strengthened by having survived their first encounter. Beyond the combat itself, American pilots had to navigate British tactics and teamwork. RAF squadrons flew in disciplined formations, emphasizing coordination, altitude advantage, and careful energy management. Many American volunteers, accustomed to a more improvisational flying style, initially struggled to adjust. But under the guidance of experienced British officers, they learned to merge their audacity with discipline, creating pilots capable of executing precise attacks under the most chaotic conditions. The psychological toll was immense. Letters home revealed the tension and fear these young men carried. They wrote of missing friends, of the roar of engines, of witnessing both destruction and heroism in the clouds above England. Some described moments of surreal beauty, the sun reflecting off Spitfire wings, clouds glowing like molten silver, or the sight of a formation of bombers silhouetted against the horizon. But these moments were fleeting. Almost immediately, they were replaced by the stark reality of combat, chasing enemy aircraft, dodging gunfire, and confronting the possibility of never returning home. Despite the hardships, American pilots quickly earned the respect of their British counterparts. They demonstrated ingenuity in dogfights, tenacity in missions, and a willingness to risk everything for the mission. Some developed reputations for extraordinary bravery, chasing enemy planes alone to protect bombers, or engaging multiple fighters to defend a squadron. Others became instructors themselves, sharing tactics and techniques with newcomers. Their presence also had a symbolic impact. Though America remained officially neutral, these volunteers embodied the transatlantic commitment to liberty, showing that the struggle in Europe mattered to ordinary citizens thousands of miles away. Their actions helped to inspire both the RAF and the British public, proving that courage transcended nationality and borders. Among the Americans, friendships deepened in ways forged only under fire. Squadrons shared camaraderie, meals, and stories of narrow escapes. Humor became a shield against fear, and mutual respect replaced initial skepticism. Pilots learned to trust each other implicitly. In aerial combat, such trust could mean the difference between life and death. By late 1940, American volunteers had begun to distinguish themselves not only as capable pilots, but as heroes of the Battle of Britain. Their contributions, though numerically small, were strategically significant. Every aircraft in the sky meant one more enemy bomber intercepted, one more civilian spared, one more airfield protected. And though the majority of Americans would not survive the war unscathed, physically or mentally, their legacy was already being written in the skies above England, in the shattered German formations, and in the admiration of the British people. The few from across the Atlantic had arrived, not as tourists or adventurers, but as soldiers in a battle for freedom, daring to act when their nation had yet to declare war. Their story was only beginning, and soon their courage would be tested in the crucible of the Luftwaffe's most intense attacks. For these young men, the Atlantic had been crossed, but the true fight was in the air, and they were ready. The moment a young American volunteer first sat in the cockpit of a Spitfire or Hurricane, the world outside became both infinitesimally small and impossibly vast. The narrow fuselage pressed against shoulders, the smell of oil and fuel filled the air, and the metallic controls were cold beneath gloved hands. Yet beyond the canopy stretched the sky of southern England, a sky that would soon become both battlefield and crucible. Every pilot knew the risks. Every pilot knew that the enemy could appear at any moment, in any form, and that survival depended on skill, timing, and instinct. The early sorties were exercises in nerves. Instructors and experienced pilots guided the newcomers through basic maneuvers, climbs, dives, turns, formation flying, and the essential mastery of energy in combat. The Americans, many of whom had trained on light civilian planes, were struck immediately by the Spitfire's power. Its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine roared with a ferocity unmatched by anything they had flown before, responding instantly to the throttle, lifting the plane with uncanny agility, twisting through the clouds with near magical precision. The Hurricane, though slightly heavier and less nimble, was equally formidable in its own right, with a rugged design that could endure punishment and still return a pilot home. Pilots learned quickly that these machines were not just tools, they were extensions of themselves. The success of a sortie depended on harmony between man and machine, on trusting that every move of the stick, every adjustment of the rudder, and every squeeze of the trigger would yield the desired result. The first time American pilots joined operational squadrons over southern England, they were confronted by the reality of the Luftwaffe in full force. Dornier Do-17s, Heinkel He-111s, and Junkers Ju-88 bombers lumbered across the sky, escorted by the swift and deadly Messerschmitt Bf-109s. The roar of engines, the rattle of gunfire, and the dense clouds of black smoke from burning aircraft created a sensory overload. Pilots had seconds to assess the situation, identify friend from foe, calculate angles of attack, and respond to sudden threats. A single misjudgment could be fatal. In those early missions, many Americans felt the raw terror of aerial combat for the first time. Their hearts raced, stomachs churned, and yet they acted. Some clutched the controls with white-knuckled determination, eyes darting between instruments, sky, and horizon. Others found a strange serenity amid chaos, a focus that allowed them to think clearly when instinct alone would not suffice. Dogfights were both art and science. Pilots spiraled and weaved, diving and climbing, attempting to gain the altitude advantage, positioning themselves for a clean shot and evading enemy fire. Tracer rounds zipped past in brilliant streaks of orange and red. Smoke trails marked the destruction of planes, a grim confirmation of success or failure. Even in the air, death was constant. Bombers that survived attacks could unleash their payloads on civilian towns below, while fighters that faltered were often torn apart in seconds. Yet Americans pressed on, motivated by loyalty to their squadrons, a sense of duty, and an unspoken agreement. No one would fight alone. The Americans also brought a distinct audacity to the fight. Unfamiliar with the traditional British caution, some pilots pushed their aircraft to the limits, diving aggressively into enemy formations, pressing attacks that others might have avoided. This boldness, combined with careful mentorship from seasoned RAF pilots, produced results. Several German aircraft were downed, their crews parachuting into the channel, their formations disrupted. The first combat kills were unforgettable. Many pilots later described the surreal clarity of the moment. The enemy aircraft ahead, the crosshair lined up, the squeeze of the trigger, and the sudden burst of fire. It was simultaneously exhilarating and horrifying. The Americans quickly learned the nuances of British combat doctrine, how to use the sun for concealment, how to coordinate wingmen in tight formations, how to climb to energy advantage and dictate the terms of engagement. They adapted rapidly, blending their courage with experience, gradually becoming not just competent pilots, but effective warriors of the sky. The personal cost was high. Fatigue accumulated quickly. Missions often lasted hours, leaving pilots physically drained and mentally strained. Sleep was fitful, often interrupted by air raid sirens. Injuries were common, whether from mechanical failures, enemy fire, or hard landings on uneven airfields. Despite this, morale remained remarkably resilient. Each return to base was met with a mixture of relief, celebration, and grim acknowledgement of losses. Pilots repaired, refueled, and prepared to climb again, understanding that every sortie could be decisive for the nation below. Beyond the immediate combat, these flights forged lasting bonds. Wingmen relied on each other for protection, shared tactics, and supported one another through fear and fatigue. Laughter, camaraderie, and quiet conversations in the mess halls at night provided a psychological counterbalance to the relentless stress of daily combat. Letters home chronicled the mixture of exhilaration, fear, and growing respect for their British comrades. The Americans learned to navigate the subtleties of British military culture, understanding not only aircraft and tactics, but also strategy, hierarchy, and the complex interplay of intelligence, radar, and command coordination. By late summer 1940, these American volunteers had become indispensable. Though numerically few, their presence in the skies contributed materially to the RAF's ability to withstand the Luftwaffe's repeated assaults. They intercepted bombers, engaged fighters, and played critical roles in the protection of key airfields and cities. Their courage was evident not just in individual exploits, but in the cumulative effect of consistent, skilled, and fearless action over weeks of grueling combat. These early missions in Spitfires and Hurricanes were the crucible in which the American volunteers were forged. Each sortie hardened their skills, sharpened their instincts, and deepened their understanding of the stakes. They became living proof that determination, skill, and courage could bridge oceans and influence the fate of nations. By the time September 1940 approached its zenith, the Americans were ready not just to survive, but to fight decisively in the Battle of Britain. They had learned to harness the power of the aircraft beneath them, to anticipate the enemy, and to trust themselves and each other. The Atlantic had been crossed, training completed, and fear mastered. Now, in the swirling skies above England, these young Americans were poised to leave their mark on history as part of a small yet unstoppable force defending freedom itself. As the Battle of Britain raged across the skies of southern England, the war was not fought by pilots alone. Behind every dogfight, every intercepted bomber, and every Spitfire returning to its battered airfield, there lay an intricate network of support, planning, and logistics. One of the most crucial contributions to Britain's survival came not from the island itself, but from across the Atlantic, the United States of America. Officially neutral in 1940, America nonetheless became the lifeline that would allow the Royal Air Force to endure when its resources were stretched to the limit. The early months of the war had revealed the fragility of Britain's industrial capacity. Airfields were damaged, aircraft were lost daily in combat, and the production of Spitfires, Hurricanes, and other essential equipment struggled to keep pace with attrition. Without reinforcement, the RAF risked being ground down by continuous Luftwaffe attacks. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood the stakes. Though constrained by neutrality laws and public opinion, he maneuvered politically and diplomatically to provide assistance in ways that could bypass legal restrictions. Initially, the aid was covert and limited, but increasingly it expanded as the reality of Britain's peril became undeniable. Private contracts and purchases facilitated the delivery of essential aircraft, parts, and munitions. American manufacturers, many of whom had once produced automobiles, were converted to produce aircraft engines, propellers, and other specialized components critical for the Spitfire and Hurricane. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and the broader Midwest operated around the clock, creating a bridge between American industrial capacity and Britain's desperate needs. One of the most significant initiatives that would later be formalized as Lend-Lease involved the shipment of aircraft and equipment across the Atlantic. Merchant vessels and cargo ships carried crates filled with Merlin engines, gun parts, aviation fuel, and other critical supplies. Convoys braved the threat of U-boats in the North Atlantic, and every safe arrival in British ports was a triumph, ensuring that squadrons remained armed, repaired, and ready to face the Luftwaffe. Beyond airplanes and munitions, technical expertise traveled alongside the equipment. American engineers worked closely with British mechanics and flight crews, providing guidance on the maintenance and optimization of engines and weaponry. Innovations from the American aviation industry were adapted to fit British aircraft, improving reliability and combat performance. These contributions, though invisible to the average Londoner watching the skies, were indispensable. They allowed squadrons to remain operational even after sustaining heavy losses, provided a steady stream of replacement aircraft, and ensured that Britain's industrial base could continue to supply the front lines. Lend-Lease also extended to raw materials, fuel, and even food, sustaining not only the military, but the civilian population enduring nightly bombing raids. American volunteers in the RAF were acutely aware of the support flowing from their homeland. They understood that each sortie they flew was backed by engines manufactured thousands of miles away, by ammunition shipped across the ocean, and by the growing political and moral support of their country. This knowledge provided not only reassurance, but a sense of purpose. They were fighting as part of a transatlantic effort, a shared commitment to freedom and survival. The impact of American aid was perhaps most vividly demonstrated during the peak of Luftwaffe assaults in August and September 1940. RAF squadrons, often operating at the limit of their endurance, were able to continue sorties thanks to the continuous supply of parts and equipment. Aircraft that might have been grounded for weeks could be returned to service in days or even hours. The difference between victory and defeat in the air was often measured not only in pilot skill, but in the reliability of the machinery they depended upon. Lend-Lease was more than just material support. It was a strategic lifeline. It symbolized America's recognition that the defense of Britain was not merely a local struggle, but a battle with global consequences. Each crate of engines, every shipment of bullets, every technical manual sent across the Atlantic was a vote of confidence, a tacit declaration that the ideals of democracy and freedom were worth protecting, even before the United States formally entered the war. This transatlantic partnership also had a profound psychological impact. British pilots and civilians alike drew confidence from knowing that, across the ocean, a powerful nation was quietly but firmly standing behind them. The knowledge that American industry and ingenuity were on their side added a layer of resolve to every mission, every scramble, and every engagement. By the autumn of 1940, the scale of American assistance had grown substantially. The Lend-Lease program, formalized in 1941 but anticipated and partially implemented earlier, became a cornerstone of Britain's ability to withstand the sustained Luftwaffe attacks. The combination of volunteer pilots in the RAF and material support from the United States created a synergy that magnified Britain's resilience. Without this aid, the strain on the RAF might have reached a breaking point. Every American engine installed in a Spitfire, every crate of ammunition delivered, and every shipment of supplies represented a tangible extension of the battlefield. It was a reminder that war was not fought solely in the air. It was also fought in factories, on cargo ships, and in the quiet calculations of logistics planners far from the front lines. The Lend-Lease initiative also set the stage for future collaboration between the United States and Britain. Pilots who had flown for the RAF would later inspire the formation of the American Eagle squadrons, and the industrial and military cooperation established during these months became a model for the Allied partnership that would dominate the rest of the war. In essence, Lend-Lease was both a practical and symbolic gesture. It ensured that Britain could continue to defend itself in the skies, while also signaling the United States' emerging role as the arsenal of democracy. It bridged the gap between isolation and engagement, providing the material and moral support that helped turn the tide in Britain's favor. By the end of 1940, as the Luftwaffe's relentless assault began to falter, the contribution of American industry and volunteers was clear. The Spitfires and Hurricanes in the sky, the bullets in their guns, and the engines that powered them were all part of a larger Atlantic alliance, a testament to cooperation, courage, and foresight. Lend-Lease, the quiet hero behind the heroics of the few, had ensured that Britain could endure, adapt, and ultimately prevail. The story of the Atlantic connection, the machinery, the shipments, and the American volunteers was a crucial chapter in the narrative of the Battle of Britain, one that would echo through history as a reminder that victory often depends as much on preparation and support as on bravery and skill in the air. The morning of September 15, 1940, dawned crisp and clear over southern England, a deceptive calm before what would become one of the most decisive days in the Battle of Britain. Radar stations blinked with incoming signals, fighter command plots filled with squiggling lines, and pilots, both British and American, prepared themselves for the storm that would soon descend from the skies. For the Americans who had volunteered in the RAF, this was the moment they had trained for, the day where skill, courage, and endurance would be tested against the might of the Luftwaffe. Reports had poured in during the early hours. Massive formations of German bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, were approaching the southeast coast, aiming to strike London and critical airfields. Fighter Command scrambled squadrons from every available station. The Americans, integrated into British squadrons, climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes, engines roaring with determination, hearts pounding with anticipation. The sky was soon alive with movement, a sprawling battlefield in 3 dimensions. Messerschmitt Bf-109s swarmed like predators, protecting Heinkel and Dornier bombers that rumbled toward their targets. The Americans' eyes scanned constantly, calculating distance, speed, and trajectory. Every maneuver mattered. Every decision could mean life or death. The battle began almost immediately. Bombers that had not yet reached their targets were intercepted by the RAF, and a chaotic dance of dives, climbs, and tight turns unfolded over Kent and Sussex. Tracer rounds zipped past, engines screamed, and smoke clouds marked the destruction of aircraft. For the young American pilots, the experience was terrifying, yet electrifying. They dove into formations of enemy planes, firing with precision, often protecting less experienced British pilots and vulnerable bombers below. One by one, enemy aircraft fell from the sky, trailing smoke as they crashed into fields or the sea. The Americans' audacity became their hallmark. Unburdened by fear of what was proper in British doctrine, they pressed attacks aggressively, taking risks that often paid off spectacularly. They disrupted bomber formations, drew enemy fighters into disadvantageous positions, and saved countless lives on the ground. Wingmen relied on each other completely. Split-second communication through radio channels and practiced signals ensured that the squadron functioned as a cohesive unit, even in the most chaotic moments. Amid the ferocity, individual heroics shone through. Pilots maneuvered Spitfires with almost preternatural skill, threading through flak bursts and avoiding deadly fire from Bf-109s. Some Americans achieved their first kills in combat that day, a combination of precision, luck, and bravery that would mark the beginning of their reputations as skilled fighters. The Luftwaffe's attacks were relentless, yet the Americans' contribution, along with the rest of Fighter Command, was decisive. As the day progressed, more bombers were intercepted, their formations broken, their objectives unfulfilled. Every downed bomber meant one less threat to London and the airfields that formed the backbone of Britain's defense. The psychological impact was enormous. British civilians watching the skies witnessed not just the courage of their own pilots, but the unmistakable presence of young men from across the Atlantic, willing to risk everything for a country that was not yet their own. For the American pilots, the satisfaction of each successful interception was tempered by the sight of comrades lost, sometimes swallowed by the sea, sometimes crashing in flames. Loss was an intimate, immediate part of the day. Grief mingled with triumph in a complex, almost unbearable emotional swirl. The heroism of September 15th was not just about individual skill. It was about coordination, planning, and resolve. Fighter Command's use of radar, the doubting system's orchestration of squadrons, and the bravery of pilots flying multiple sorties created a synergy that turned the tide of the battle. Americans were not mere observers or adjuncts. They were integral participants in a struggle that would determine the fate of Britain. As the afternoon waned, the Luftwaffe began to retreat, battered, confused, and demoralized. Their losses were substantial, both in aircraft and experienced crews. The skies, once filled with the roar of engines and tracer fire, gradually quieted. The Americans landed, their planes marked with smoke and minor battle damage, adrenaline still coursing through their veins. The reality of the day sank in slowly. They had faced one of the largest coordinated enemy attacks in history and survived. They had contributed directly to what British Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later call the day that saved Britain. Pilots celebrated, but quietly, for the losses were keenly felt. Each name on the casualty lists was remembered, honored, and mourned. Letters home were written with care, detailing the intensity of the battle, while often omitting the horrors, a mixture of pride and protective discretion. September 15th became emblematic of the American spirit integrated into the British defense. Though the United States remained officially neutral, its citizens had flown in combat, demonstrating courage, skill, and commitment. Their actions exemplified the principle that freedom is defended not just by nations, but by the individuals willing to stand against oppression wherever it arises. The day also solidified the role of volunteers as trusted and respected members of their squadrons. British pilots, who had initially been skeptical of American recruits, came to rely on them, recognizing their audacity, precision, and unwavering dedication. Many lifelong friendships were formed that day, bonds forged under fire that would endure long after the war ended. Beyond the immediate tactical victory, September 15th sent a message to the world. Britain could and would endure. The Luftwaffe's failure to achieve air superiority marked a turning point in the Battle of Britain, and the contributions of American volunteers, though few in number, highlighted the emerging international dimension of the fight against tyranny. Their courage was not measured solely by victories in the air, but by the willingness to act decisively when circumstances were dire, when the stakes were nothing less than the survival of a nation and the principles it represented. As dusk fell over southern England, the Americans returned to base, weary but resolute. Engines were cooled, weapons checked, and debriefings held, but the impact of the day was already clear. They had participated in history, their names becoming part of a larger narrative of bravery, sacrifice, and international solidarity. September 15th was more than a date on the calendar. It was a testament to the American volunteers' courage, their integration into the RAF, and the shared commitment of two nations separated by an ocean but united by a common purpose. It was a day that would be remembered not just in Britain, but across the Atlantic, inspiring future generations of pilots, historians, and citizens who understood the cost of freedom and the valor required to defend it. As the skies of Britain finally began to clear and the roar of battle diminished, the impact of the American volunteers in the Royal Air Force became unmistakably clear. These young men, who had crossed an ocean to fight in a foreign war, had contributed not only to the survival of Britain during its darkest hours, but also to the forging of a transatlantic bond that would shape the outcome of the Second World War. Their legacy was multifaceted, tactical, symbolic, and deeply human. On the tactical level, American pilots demonstrated extraordinary skill and courage that directly affected the outcome of numerous engagements during the Battle of Britain. Although their numbers were small, their presence was disproportionately significant. Their audacity in the air, their willingness to engage enemy formations aggressively, and their adaptability to British aircraft and combat tactics added a new dimension to Fighter Command's capabilities. In many cases, their daring actions disrupted Luftwaffe operations, saved countless civilian lives, and provided critical support to British squadrons whose pilots were already stretched to the limits of endurance. Beyond individual bravery, the Americans helped to inspire their British comrades. Their determination and fearlessness exemplified a spirit of international solidarity, proving that the fight against tyranny transcended borders. Squadron leaders reported that the morale boost provided by these volunteers was tangible. The knowledge that there were allies willing to risk life and limb for a common cause strengthened cohesion and resolve. The Americans' integration into RAF squadrons also highlighted the importance of collaboration across cultures and systems. They adapted to British protocols, learned to communicate effectively under pressure, and blended their innate resourcefulness with the discipline of RAF operations. This fusion of skills created pilots capable of extraordinary feats, demonstrating that courage and ingenuity, when coupled with structure and coordination, could achieve remarkable outcomes, even under extreme stress. Symbolically, the contributions of the American volunteers carried profound significance. They embodied a bridge between two nations, showing that the Atlantic Ocean, while vast, was not a barrier to the defense of freedom. Their actions foreshadowed the broader U.S. engagement in the war that would follow, signaling the beginning of a deep military and political partnership that would prove decisive in the years to come. Even before the United States officially entered the conflict in December 1941, these volunteers had already become living proof of America's commitment to the defense of democracy and liberty. The human dimension of their legacy is equally compelling. Many of the volunteers paid the ultimate price. Their lives were lost in the skies over England or the Channel, leaving families and communities thousands of miles away to grieve. Yet their sacrifice was honored in Britain and America alike. Memorials, plaques, and ceremonies commemorated the bravery of those who had given everything for a cause greater than themselves. Stories of their heroism were passed down through generations, becoming part of the collective memory of both nations and inspiring future pilots, historians, and citizens alike. The volunteers' legacy also influenced the future of transatlantic military cooperation. Their integration into RAF squadrons provided a practical model for subsequent coordination between American and British forces. When the U.S. formally entered the war, the lessons learned from these early experiences proved invaluable, facilitating the rapid establishment of American units in Europe and the effective deployment of men and material alongside British forces. Museums and air shows continue to honor the achievements of these pioneers. Restored Spitfires and Hurricanes, often bearing the markings of American pilots, soar across the skies as living reminders of the courage and skill demonstrated during those critical months. Exhibits tell the stories of individual volunteers, their missions, and their sacrifices, ensuring that their contributions are remembered not as footnotes, but as integral threads in the fabric of history. The legacy of the American volunteers also resonates on a personal level. Survivors and their families recount stories of camaraderie, fear, laughter, and shared struggle. Letters, diaries, and photographs reveal the humanity behind the heroism. The moments of doubt, the exhilaration of flight, the grief for fallen comrades, and the bonds formed in the crucible of combat. These narratives humanize history, reminding us that wars are fought not only with strategies and machines, but with courage, determination, and the spirit of individuals who choose to stand for what they believe is right. Today, the story of the American volunteers in the Battle of Britain serves as a timeless testament to bravery, sacrifice, and international solidarity. It is a reminder that even when official policies of neutrality or distance prevail, individuals have the power to act decisively in the face of injustice. Theirs is a legacy of daring, skill, and moral conviction, a story of men who crossed oceans to defend freedom in a moment when it hung precariously in the balance. In retrospect, the contribution of these volunteers can be seen as both a practical and symbolic victory. Practically, they bolstered the RAF's ranks and helped tip the balance in crucial dogfights. Symbolically, they embodied the unity of purpose and shared ideals that would define the Allied effort for the remainder of the war. Their actions inspired not only their contemporaries, but countless generations that followed, showing that courage, determination, and the willingness to act, even far from home, can change the course of history. As we look back on the Battle of Britain, it is impossible to separate the heroism of the few from the bravery of the American volunteers who flew alongside them. Together, they created a legacy that continues to resonate in aviation history, military strategy, and the shared narrative of freedom defended against overwhelming odds. Their story is not just about warplanes, squadrons, or aerial tactics. It is about the human spirit, its resilience, and its capacity to rise to extraordinary challenges. The Eagles of the Atlantic, as they came to be remembered, ensured that Britain would endure, that hope would survive, and that a small group of determined men could leave an indelible mark on the skies of history. Their courage, skill, and sacrifice are forever etched into the annals of World War II, a lasting tribute to what can be achieved when valor crosses borders and hearts align in the defense of freedom.